Hello and welcome to the Dear InfoSec podcast, where we talk about, tackle and even solve some of the many problems that practitioners face every day. So if you have a problem and need some help, get in touch at dearinfosec@securityforum.org and we'll assemble a team of experts to look into it and give advice. Today we're talking about a problem lots of folks, InfoSec and otherwise, are facing, which is handling all the regulatory and operational issues that generative AI and other similar kinds of things are creating for organizations. It's definitely a tough and complex task, but we've got just the right people here to talk it through. My name is Mark Ward. I've done some work on generative AI's big brother, that's machine learning. And definitely know my way around AI from many a movie, novel, and philosophy class. One of my kids is studying philosophy, and he wants to be uploaded to a computer. I'm not sure if they're teaching that at university, but he'd be quite happy to live forever inside a computer, apparently. But anyway, first guest is Steve Dorward, who is currently at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and he was a software architect who's handled quite a fair few AI projects. Are you an experienced AI wrangler, Steve?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, probably some would call it maybe a cowboy rather than a wrangler, but I've been doing parts of AI, machine learning, process automation since a rollback with Lloyds Bank in sort of 2018. Pre the chat GPT generative AI hype, if you will, and I've sort of see it progress since then. So various roles since then. Performance coach with a company called HPC, trying to sort of get a level of knowledge over. But wrangler's probably a good phrase.
A good way to phrase it. But I wonder if we're in the sort of early web type days for AI, in that sort of people are kind of having to build it themselves rather than sort of just turn to the web and construct the bit, get the bits they need to construct it. Is it still quite hands on?
It's actually quite interesting, because at the start I would say it was very hands on, because back to the AI's been around since the 50s, Alan Turing and all that. But in my sort of lifetime, it was very hands-on if you want to get near it. Then it became a little bit more packaged within sort of the SAPs and the Oracles of this world. And then now what they're trying to do, certainly the big vendors of Microsoft and others, are putting a lot of these tools, the Copilot Studio tools, in the hands of citizen developers. So not in the hands of me per se as a software or a technical lead, but more in the hands of an end user. So if someone knows about a business process, give that person the generative AI chatbot tooling, they go off and create it, plug it into generative AI, and away they go, which again brings lots of need for guardrails and policy, not just internally, but
lots of interesting issues, which we will delve into shortly. But also here is Verona Johnstone-Hulse, who is UK Head of Government Affairs at the NCC Group and definitely knows her way around the regulations surrounding the use of AI. Hello, Verona.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming along. But I think there are a lot of regulations, so I don't know, do you have a massive file of them somewhere, or are you surprised at how many there are? Because I guess lots of governments just want to try and corral this stuff, don't they?
They do. I mean, on the one hand, you've got a lot of existing regulations that already govern parts of AI, whether it's data privacy or some of the cybersecurity regs that are in place. But it's definitely an evolving picture in terms of actually introducing specific regulation and legislation around AI. And actually, in reality, it's only really the EU and a couple of the states in North America that are actually either passed or got close to passing specific laws governing AI. At the moment, the likes of the UK, Australia, federal government in the US are still trying to work out what they're doing in this space. So a bit of an evolving picture.
Yeah, I guess that makes it a bit tricky because organisations are having to jump before they know which way things are going to land.
Yeah, that is a fair point. I guess in some ways, like we saw with GDPR, there was the European Union moving first and others then followed. So I think we're seeing something very similar when it comes to the AI Act, in that the European Union has been the first really at a supranational level or a national level to really implement something that is quite comprehensive and related to AI. So I think for other governments, there's an element of sit back and watch and see. And then for organisations that are having to manage compliance, really the main thing that will be on their agenda is looking at how do we comply with those quite ambitious timelines that the AI Act in Europe sets, whilst also keeping an eye on some of the others that might come into effect in the next sort of few months and years, which largely seem to be at state-driven level in the US, but the UK is obviously also looking at its potential AI bill.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of beyond that as well. And India's got all kinds of thoughts. Same with China, obviously. It's very interested in the political and policy aspects of all this. So, yeah, I think it's only going to get more complicated. But also, last but not least, is Lee Munson, ISF researcher who is currently involved in a project looking at lots of bits of AI. Hello, Lee.
Hello, Mark. Yes, you're right. I'm currently looking at offensive and defensive AI, which is very interesting. And to go back to a point you brought up earlier, my conclusion at the moment is there's a lot of hype around.
There is, yeah, definitely. But that's an actual question I sort of wanted to open with. Just, is there too much? Is it too gung ho? Is there too much hype out there? I don't know, you, Lee, you're sure about that. But any particular reason for that? Is it just too many organisations making too many promises, and it's actually not AI what they're peddling?
I mean, looking specifically at the area I'm researching at the moment with the offensive and defensive threats, I think it's just more of the same, but enhanced a little bit. Perhaps 2-3 years from now, it's going to be a completely different landscape. But right now, we're just seeing better phishing emails, some deepfake videos, etc. If you've got the security basics right, you probably don't need to worry about it too much today.
I think what we're seeing in the cybersecurity space, that to your point, Lee, is that it's enhancing rather than necessarily revolutionizing the threat picture. So yes, it's enabling more sophisticated phishing attacks. It's enabling higher number of attacks to be undertaken. But in terms of that cyber Armageddon type picture, I think we're a long way from that.
Yeah, I think it's going to come though fairly soon. I see it evolving somewhat like ransomware. So you can go on the dark web and buy an AI attack toolkit as a service, something like that.
I don't know, Steve, is sort of with your developer hat on, former developer hat on, is it? I just wonder if it is a sort of an accelerant for software development, and whether that translates into new things and genuine change, or whether it is just you do the same things faster.
I think that, I mean, just to touch on the hype piece, I mean, Gartner have their hype curves that I'm sure a number of us have seen around emerging technology, and you know, Gen AI has reached that sort of peak of inflated expectation, I think they call it, and it's on its way to the trough, if you will. So, you know, there is just too much hype around it, and I think that noise narrative, you know, some of the work I'm doing is to try with senior leaders around removing some of that noise, if you will, and saying, look, this is the actual real threat of it, and here's the real opportunity. And I always start with the threat, sort of play here's the bad things that could happen, but actually here's all the good things you could use it for. But on the piece around the barrier to entry, I think for, you know, nefarious actors, if you will, is now so low, or, you know, so easy to get access to. All you really need is an email to go and create a ChatGPT account or a Microsoft account, and away you go. You don't need vast amounts of infrastructure. You don't need nation states. You don't need, so this idea of having, people in banks of server rooms, going away hacking. It could be a teenager in, up where I am in Scotland or wherever you guys are, going away and doing stuff. It's a little bit like the War Games film, if you remember back to, Matthew Broderick. It feels like, we've come about full circle with it. So
yeah. Amazing how many times that movie gets quoted for sex circles, but he is that rising tide lifting all the boats, isn't it? I think that sort of, I wonder if those bad guys. I don't know if, Lee, you have a sense of this, whether the bad guys are at the same kind of point lots of organisations are. They're just kind of finding out what it can do for them, and yeah, they are getting some early gains in productivity, but not much more than that.
At the moment, it's a bit of a discovery phase, a bit of cat and mouse. I think the bad guys are using it to scale up attacks. Not too far in the future, I suspect we'll see AI starting to probe network defenses a lot more. Be an interesting avenue, automated ransomware. But interestingly, one of the biggest risks I'm seeing at the moment is the use of defensive AI tripping organizations up as they use it to automate too much.
All right.
And sort of relinquish that human oversight to a degree.
Yeah. Verona, you're nodding there. I don't know if you see that at all, whether that's something the regulators are worried about, just letting this stuff go unchecked, or whether there's sort of, just as good practice, it's worth keeping those humans in the loop.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the principles that have been agreed across government and that are starting to be embedded in regulatory frameworks definitely try and keep that level of human oversight and try to remove the risk around AI making poor decisions or making decisions that are essentially going to impact negatively on an individual at the endpoint. So I think that there is definitely that need to maintain some kind of human oversight and not just, enable kind of AI to run away with itself.
Yeah, but I wonder if are the regulations framed differently to something like GDPR? Because obviously with that, you've got a thing you can protect, so that privacy, and I guess it's tricky to measure. You could get a sense of whether that information has been treated well or badly or lost or stolen. But with AI, is it about outcomes? It doesn't matter how the organization gets there. Is it sort of try not to do these things with the tools is that what they're going for?
It's tricky because I think at this stage, with the exception of the EU's AI Act, we haven't really got detailed regulatory frameworks for other jurisdictions. So there's the kind of broad-based principles that have been agreed. So, we all agree there should be good transparency, embed safety and security principles from the outset, ensure that human rights are protected, that you take measures to mitigate bias. The difficulty is because it's an evolving picture, and also some of the measures to counteract some of those risks are evolving quite quickly. So some of the technologies around being able to detect deepfakes or being able to address issues of bias within systems and things like that, the actual technological solutions are reasonably they're advancing at some pace in the same way that the negative side of AI is too. So where governments and regulators are trying to set these principles, actually I think the proof will be in the pudding to some degree in terms of how they actually regulate in practice, whilst you're also operating in a very fast moving technological landscape. And there are some synergies that we've seen in the cybersecurity world where you have seen regulators move much more towards that outcomes based regulation, because the way in which you can address risks or the threats that are emerging is moving so quickly that trying to embed specific measures into regulations is quickly they become outdated. That said, on the other hand, not having those practical measures and regulators not supporting organizations with advice and practical case studies of how they can comply with regulations means that there can be a period where organizations don't actually know what they need to be doing to comply. So it's a tricky balance to strike.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve, I don't know if you're confronting any of this with this.
No, I have to agree with Verona. I mean, in a previous role, I started to look at the 500 or so pages of the EU AI Act and, got a little bit into it and actually used a generative AI tool to help read that, whether it was allowed or not. But, I think that does help you set out the different risk levels of, whether it's biometrics, whether it's, using deep fakes. And, so it does give that risk framework. What I've seen in certainly in the UK and more specifically in Scotland is Scotland doesn't have a Scottish AI Act. I've asked that question of the Permanent Secretary a couple of times. I've asked that of something called the Scottish AI Alliance, and there's also something called the Task Force, which sounds a little bit Star Warsy, but these are really sort of collaborations. I quite like the approach in Scotland. I don't know what Verona's view is in terms of the UK, but I quite like the approach in Scotland of creating something called an AI register, where any tool, whether it's an internal tool used for public services or potentially private sector companies, you register this tool so that it builds public confidence in the tool. So if for instance, the service is being used for, making decisions on benefits or disability allowance or whatever that might be, that's factored in so that the public themselves can become more comfortable with the tools. And again, maybe Scotland's taking a lead in that. I don't know if I think they're maybe one of the first jurisdictions in the UK to look at that. But interested in Verona's views about what's coming with the sort of more conclusive sort of UK piece.
Yeah, I think so. At the UK level, we obviously have a new government, so that puts a question mark at the moment about what the exact future looks like in terms of AI regulation. That said, the new Labour government has announced its intention to introduce an AI bill, which I think they're going to consult on sometime before the end of this year, and that will be not at the same scale as the EU's AI Act. it will be much more focused on general purpose AI frontier models. And then reports are saying that we'll see a continuation of the previous government's approach, whereby you're setting principles at a high level that then regulators need to interpret for their specific sectors and update their sector-specific regulations, which seems like a pretty sensible approach to me. And there was a really interesting report out this month from the Tony Blair Institute on what the future of the UK's AI legislative landscape should look like. And the conclusions from that report were essentially not to make sure that you're putting in the safeguards, because we need those safeguards now, but also not to try and introduce too much within that forthcoming AI bill, and make sure that it's very principles-based, it's flexible, and can adapt to the threat and the technological landscape in an appropriate way, rather than necessarily trying to put onto the legislative books something that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, would become outdated in sort of 5-10 years' time.
Yeah, or even quicker. I don't know, Lee, talking to members, I mean, you're sort of establishing a community of interest around the research you're doing, but are there common things coming out of those conversations? Is regulation featuring quite highly on those, or is it something else that people are just like, we just need to get on with this, really?
Yeah, regulation does come up a fair bit. What I find is really interesting, though, is a lot of the members aren't really asking about it from a security perspective. It's more of a broader business perspective and how those differences between jurisdictions are going to play out. You know, they're looking for a balance that sort of thwarts those risks we've talked around about biases, etc., but also allows innovation and rapid movement in the space at the same time, because they're looking for business advantage too.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I guess that's at the moment, there is a bit of a sort of space for them to operate because the regulations aren't quite sorted and they can kind of get on with it. But I wonder if sort of retrospectively, Steve, I don't know, I guess it's harder to adapt after the fact. It's much better to know upfront what you are expected to do and what your sort of markers of good behavior are before you get going.
I kind of liken it to, the car. The car was invented many moons ago, and then suddenly, people then realize you need a license and you need some sort of tax and MOT, and you need to go through that. Whereas AI, is out there, people have been using it, and I think part of the challenge is there's so many regulations, not just from a policy, a legal perspective, but you've got ISO standards, you've got NIST, you've got a whole stuff. I tried to draw out a page quite recently around trying to understand the whole landscape of regulation, not just from a data regulation, GDPR, but from an ISO perspective. ISO 27001, I think it is, in terms of information security. There's now an ISO one for artificial intelligence, for instance. But then you've got policies from UNICEF. You've got policies from again, the AI Alliance, you've got EU GDPR, and there's just so many things in there, and trying to navigate that roadmap and all the speed humps and bumps that you go through. And one big spectre, given where I work currently in terms of CEPA, is the sustainability angle and, the compliance with, the carbon emissions, because AI is particularly thirsty in terms of its water use because of, the amount of water that goes and cools the servers. 500 millilitres water for a typical conversation is quite a scary stat. Microsoft emissions, and I'm sure Amazon's emissions have gone up because of the increasing insatiable need to go and generate, a picture of a cat, on a mat. For me, it's just getting a little bit out of control. And where does it end? These massive big data centers in Nevada, and
No, I think the data center stuff is interesting and relevant because like Microsoft, Amazon, Google are all getting into the power generation business because they see that as a potential sort of slowing down point for them that will just stop that growth and stop them offering these kinds of services. But I just wonder if the laws governing this should be much easier. I mean, whether it should just be we circulated this prior to this recording. Just Asimov's laws of robotics. Isaac Asimov, very venerated science fiction writer, did 3 laws of robotics, which basically revolve around trying to do no harm. But I just wonder to human beings, and robots should. And I guess we can sort of use AI as a proxy for robots. But Verona, would that be too broad? Just do no harm? Because I guess a lot of these things are going to be commercial, and there's some exploitation that's kind of built in to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is, what do we mean by harm? It's a very subjective concept. No matter, where you are in the world, will have very different opinions about what harm means and, how that interacts with things like human rights and bias. And so I think that on the face of it, it feels simple. And even when you to kind of go to the next level of that and look at some of the principles that have been agreed at a high level, there was a really good development actually in Bletchley last year, where the UK hosted the big AI summit and we had the Bletchley Agreement, and the fact that you had the US and China and the EU all signing up to a central agreement that we need to deploy frontier models safely and responsibly was a really good thing. But actually the detail that sits underneath that is super, super important, and ultimately we need governments to be able to define things like, what do we mean by harm, and then be able to set the detailed rules that sit under that. And I think, coming back to your analogy, Stephen, around the car, when vehicles first were on our road, they didn't have airbags. They, I'm not even sure they had brakes. They probably did have brakes. I'm probably making that up. But, they didn't have necessarily, the vehicles weren't built with the safety measures in mind. Drivers were driving recklessly. There was loads of crashes. People died. And as such, you did need government to step in to be able to set those rules of the road, literally, and not just set the rules, but also define who is responsible for what. So, drivers have a certain level of responsibility, but then vehicle manufacturers have an even greater responsibility to implement safety measures. And I think that when it comes to AI, that's going to be, all of those important questions about who is responsible for what is going to be really important to nail down.
Yeah, I just wonder what era we are at in AI compared to sort of cars, whether it's, are we at the point where it's somebody walking in front of the car with a red flag, or are we sort of a bit further down the road?
I think with the Model T, Henry Ford, because it's so if you liken, again, to maybe stretch this analogies too far, but if you take, OpenAI, given the vast number of users, maybe that is the Model T. You get that out there, you got the crank handle at the start, and then you start getting into sort of mass production and all that element, and everyone learns from that. But I still think it's very early days in terms of the possibilities, and also definitely the threats. I mean, just to touch on your Asimov's rules, I did think a little bit about this, and probably two things. One is he had a hidden fourth rule, or a less known fourth law, which was that AI shouldn't impact on humankind, not just on humans. So, what does that mean? Does that mean mental health? Does that mean, the humankind as an actual species? Again, maybe getting a little bit dystopian, but and then I start to think about putting those into actual practice of having, my own laws of that in terms of, how to work out the dynamics between them. Because again, when I take that down to technology, you really need to sort of understand how you're doing your data, how you're doing your security, how you're doing your threat surfaces, all that good stuff from a security perspective, way before you get in putting a tool in front of a member of the public or even an employee.
Yeah, I've certainly seen some member organisations do that, sort of keep the AI away from their customers. But also, I read some. There's a great book by a mathematics professor called Rudy Rucker, who's a bit of a counterculture figure as well. Which is about robots becoming sentient and pretty much rejecting Asimov's laws. And I think one of the quotes by Ralph Numbers, who's the robot hero of the story, says that the Asimov's laws are all about humans first and robots last. And his response to that is, forget it, no way, it should be robots first. I just wonder, Leo, because you mentioned as we were starting this conversation about your AI rig. So I don't know, do you fear our robot overlords? I don't know, are we anywhere? Because you mentioned a few years' time you'll curious about how things are going to develop. Is it going to be that fast, do you think?
Yeah, so for me, the main reason I have my own personal AI rig is so that I can run LLMs locally and generate images locally, because I just don't want to share that. I actually see that as one of the bigger risks of AI at the moment, people oversharing with these models. But yeah, I've already learned how to do some interesting things on it, and I'm definitely not a technical person. It took me about 2 days to figure out how to create deepfake images. Currently trying to figure out how to create deepfake video. So going back to that earlier point, barriers to entry are fairly low. Yeah, I've got a decent gaming PC, but it's nothing special. But I can create these images in seconds.
Yeah, I think I've messed around with it as well, and there's a knack to it, and we certainly chat to our internal designers who do use these tools, and they get better results because they're more skilled. But they also sometimes rub up against the fact that they are too easy to use and that they're not very bright. And if you ask them to do something, it does that thing, and then you need to use your expertise to constrain them. I don't know if, Steve, is that sort of what you're seeing? Just that good, people who are skilled can get more out of these things, or is it, I don't know how they're being applied by people?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of terms that will get thrown around. Prompt engineering, that was something, in terms of getting the best out of it, and again, comes back to, what's the most popular language in AI world. It's not Python, it's maybe English language or the language that you speak. So you can now ask, maybe to Lee's point, you can now ask your rig, go and create me a website, go and create me some Python code, go and create me a set of regulations. I mean, I'm using Copilot probably on an hourly basis to help my productivity piece. So I think, the barrier of entry is just now so low, but you're now starting to see the real benefits of it, even just to create a policy. So internally, I'm now using Copilot to generate a generative AI policy that will actually go out to staff. Yes, I'll look at it and I'll get sign off, etc. But it's just trying to get people comfortable with it in small pieces before you then jump on to other parts of AI, whether that's machine learning or process automation, to do massive, big, large scale public service work. Again, Alan Turing Institute did lots of research around millions of man hours, woman hours per year could be saved with process automation. So yeah, I think we're just very much at the start, as we said before.
Yeah. I don't know, in terms of, given what you said about regulation, and some of it is a bit opaque at the moment. So for organisations, do they have to make some decisions for themselves? Is that sort of where they should be going? Just what they're happy to do and how they're happy for it, to treat their customers and things?
Yeah, I would partly that, but then also there is a reasonable amount of detail in the EU's AI Act. And so I think that almost using that as your starting point, the way in which things will be regulated will be different in the US. California is just potentially about to pass its own law, and will have the added complication that states might have different laws in the US, and then the UK is kind of doing its own thing. Australia is also consulting on mandating safeguards for high-risk settings, the use of AI in high-risk settings. So there is an emerging landscape, but in the meantime, we do have the EU's AI Act. It's reasonably detailed in terms of which systems are going to be under scrutiny and which are going to have to implement those minimum safeguards. And then, although some of the details yet to be determined in terms of codes of practice and that sort of thing, actually there is within the Act itself, but also the broader principles, as I mentioned earlier, that have been agreed at an international level. There is a reasonable amount of detail and amount of guidance out there in terms of what are the kind of responsible steps that you should be taking in order to be able to meet the different aspects of those principles. So it is complicated, and there unfortunately will be a period where organizations, particularly global organizations, are going to have the headache of navigating different global regimes, much in the same way we've seen cybersecurity regulation evolve or data privacy regulation. But in the meantime, the information does exist out there. And actually, if you are operating in the EU, the compliance deadlines are going to come around quite quickly. So you really do need to be starting to get your head around whether you're going to be in scope of that piece of legislation. And if you are, what are the kind of steps that you need to take towards compliance?
Yeah. Lee, are you seeing that sort of people starting to move on this, or establishing for themselves what they're happy to do? The reason I ask that is a couple of members I've talked to have had some parts of their organization go just crazy. Yeah, we need to use it. And then they, the developers turn and say, actually, there's a better way to do this, and it's cheaper, and it's not an experiment, and we know it works. And they're like, oh, but what are you doing? And it's like, well, just because you want to doesn't mean it's better. I don't know. Did you get any of that from our members at all?
Yeah, it is still a really strange time at the moment. I mean, just going back to the regulation first, organizations want these rules to be as short and as woolly as possible, so they can grab the opportunities. Lawyers, and I know several, like their laws to have zero ambiguity, so there's a massive conflict there. Members I've spoken to, again, there's that conflict there. You've got some people, mostly those in IT, who are thinking, can we move it to another jurisdiction so we can do what we like with it and play with it? But then you say to them, so you're playing with AI, what are you going to do with it? What's the business case for what you're doing? They don't have answers. So again, it goes back to this hype thing. There's a lot of people out there in security, in IT, and the broader business who are thinking we should be using AI, but they don't really know why.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. It's the idea of generative AI, especially as this hammer, and you're walking around trying to find nails to hit with it, And somebody asked me the other day and said, we at this sort of peak of using the tools, and I think something about the jump the shark moment of have we played out with generative AI? It seems to have been done a level to death in certain areas. But I think all of these is somebody else will find another use for it. The regulation piece still does worry me because again it'll apply to some sectors and maybe doesn't apply to others. But yeah, I think we're still very early days.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm definitely on the downslope to that trough of disillusionment because I've played around with it a bit, and occasionally it's useful and occasionally it's not. And I think there's some things I know I can do with it, but it has to be said, maybe there's some aspects of my job that it would take a lot more work. And at the moment, I can do them in different ways and better ways, I think faster ways, because it's that crazy sort of, it's a new tool and let's spend 5 times as long doing the same thing I used to do, and just because I want to use that thing.
What I would say in terms of risk frameworks, if you will, is that, trying to work through that with an actual use case in mind that you've got senior buy-in to, whether that's, an internal chatbot to ask queries for a new joiner, for instance, might be a good way of testing that out on a small market, testing the boundaries of what your risk appetite might be at a board level, involve your senior stakeholders in the steering group. So that's separate to sort of external regulation, but, get senior people comfortable and seeing the benefits of it. Therefore, when you come to then sell the bigger parts of it and then come and ask for sign off of the regulation, then they've already seen what it can do or can't do, or where some of the challenges are.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. Help the organisation see how it can prove itself, and then sort of move on. I don't. The NCC group, are you guys using AI? I imagine you have a lot of data that you to sift and analyse.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like everyone else that operates, I guess, in a technology-enabled world. We use it. We've been using it for a while. So historically, we've been using it within our managed detection services for quite a long time, and there are lots of positive ways in which you can use AI, whether it's analysis of data, as you say, logs, files, using it in threat intelligence. But as kind of Lee mentioned, you have to kind of caveat that with that this isn't the be all and end all, and actually the kind of human element of cybersecurity is still fundamental to being able to build resilience. So yes, we're using it. We have been using it for some time, and I'm sure there'll be lots of new positive use cases for how we can use it in future. But then it kind of comes back to why we need governments to set what the rules of the road are so that we can all benefit from those positive use cases.
Yeah, sort of guide that use of it, for sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we, as you said, Lee, we're kind of living in interesting times for it, that sort of slight interregnum between what the governments are saying. There is some detail out there, but there's going to be more. And I guess organisations need to prove to themselves sort of what they want to do with AI and what they're happy doing. But read a couple of case studies with organisations who said the ethical side of it was the tricky part, not the sort of organisational, operational acceleration that they can get, but it's just, well, what does that turn our organisation into? What have we surrendered when we do those kinds of things? But yeah, I'm sure this is a topic we'll come back to. Thanks to Lee, thanks to Verona, thanks to Steve. Thanks for listening. Tell your friends. You can now find ISO podcasts on all major podcast platforms. Just search for Dear InfoSec where you get your podcasts, or look for our page on Audioboom, where you can subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. The podcasts are also available at securityforum.org, where you can also learn lots more about ISF research, tools, and guidance.